In Georgia, as you know, they're having just a rock'em sock'em robots, very exciting election. Top of the ticket in the Georgia governor's race, Republican candidate Brian Kemp, currently the Secretary of State. The Democratic candidate, Stacey Abrams, who until recently was the Democratic leader in the state legislature. The last few Georgia governor's races have been close. They've all been decided by roughly 200,000 votes. Heading into this election, though, as Georgia's Secretary of State, Brian Kemp has taken a meat axe to the voter rolls in Georgia, trying to disqualify as many potential voters as possible. I said the last few governor's races in that state were decided by around 200,000 votes. Last year alone, Brian Kemp took 670,000 people off the voting rolls. And as we headed into this election season, with him as the Republican candidate for governor, and with him in his office still administering this election, even though he's running in it, we learned that his office had taken more than 50,000 new applications for voter registrations and essentially just stuck them in a desk drawer somewhere in his office, put them all on hold in pending status. More than 50,000 registrations. That led to calls not just from his opponent, Stacey Abrams, but also from former Georgia governor and former President Jimmy Carter, that Brian Kemp should step down as Secretary of State while he's running for governor, so he will not be in the position of both umpiring this match and competing in it at the same time. Kemp, of course, refused to step down, so he's still in that dual role in the state. But the courthouse doors apparently are still open, and the courts still have the lights on in Georgia. Today, a subset of those 50,000 plus voter registration applications that his office had put on ice, about 3,000 voters who are recently naturalized U.S. citizens, who Kemp's office was blocking from voting. A court in Georgia today ruled that those thousands of Georgia residents must be allowed to vote, even though Kemp's office has been blocking them from doing so up until now. And like I said, judges generally don't weigh in to fix even really bad voting rights abominations if it's too close to the election. But in Georgia, what Brian Kemp was trying to do here was bad enough to overpower that controlling precedent. I mean, it was sort of remarkable what they're trying to get away with. Kemp's office had taken these 3,000 plus voters who had cast absentee ballots or had applied to register to vote. And they'd all been flagged and set aside, flagged as potential non-citizens. These people had then shown up with their citizenship paperwork, showing that they have become citizens. Here's my naturalization certificate. This proves I'm a citizen. And even still, even with that official paperwork, Kemp's office was still saying, no, we still choose to believe you're not a citizen, despite you proving to the contrary, because we have you flagged that way. That's what they were trying to get away with. Until as of today, this court in Georgia now ruled that that cannot stand. Those people must be allowed to vote. Kemp's office can no longer block them from voting. That happened this afternoon, and now tonight it's just happened again. Another court ruling in Georgia just as I was walking to the studio, just as we were getting on the air tonight. This is a new one just tonight, blocking Brian Kemp's office from rejecting voters because of a supposed mismatch in their signature on file. They can no longer block people from voting if they think the signature doesn't match the signature on file, unless and until they give the voter a chance to prove his or her identity, give the voter a chance to contest their ballot being thrown out by proving their own name. Which means, I mean, yeah, it has to be really, 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 really bad. But sometimes judges don't close the courthouse doors and turn out the lights just because it's time to actually use our rights instead of just talking about them in the abstract. Those two voting rights rulings, even tonight, Friday night, as we head toward Tuesday's election. Today was the last day of early voting in Georgia. For the last day of early voting today, people were lined up before dawn, lined up in the dark to cast their ballots. That enthusiasm we've been seeing in Georgia in particular, but it really is remarkable the number of people who have voted already all around the country. You might have seen these numbers today, but I just find them kind of amazing. The last time we had an election where there wasn't a president on the ballot, last time we had a midterm election like this one was 4 years ago in 2014. When we were 4 days out from that election, when we were at this point in the 2014 election, this is the number of people who had voted. Now in this year's election, with us 4 days out, so it's apples to apples comparison between the two elections, look at that. That's how many people have already voted nationwide. Nearly double. It's just stunning. NBC broke out these key 8 states: Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Montana, Nevada, Tennessee, Texas. All states where there are really interesting and important races this year. And in all of them, look at that, from 2014 to 2018, in every single one of them, you see that same pattern, where the total early vote at this point in the race in 2014 is just dwarfed by the number of people who have turned out this year, 4 days out from the election. And here's one really interesting thing that we've noticed in the voting patterns this year so far. We noticed this in part because we've been so interested watching what's been going on in Georgia. And Georgia, like all these other states, Georgia has seen a huge increase in the number of people voting early ahead of Election Day. Today's the last day of early voting in Georgia. And look, they have way more than doubled their early vote this year compared to this time 4 years ago. I mean, with this kind of advantage from the early vote, it's not inconceivable that Georgia's going to end up, totally doubling the number of votes they had in the last election in 2014. They may get up to 2016 numbers. But when you look at who is turning out in Georgia, who is turning out to vote, what we've found is that, as far as we can tell, Georgia voters so far show the biggest gender gap that we've seen anywhere else in the country. Basically, every state we've looked at, more women are voting than men. But in Georgia, it is the biggest gap that we are seeing anywhere. So far, 56% of people turning out to early vote in Georgia, 56% are women, 44% are men. That's a 12-point gender gap, as big as we have seen in any state in the country. And it's bigger than anything we saw in any state that we looked at from 2014. And I don't know if it's a symptom of that or a cause of that when the Democratic Georgia governor candidate, Stacey Abrams, holds a blockbuster political event like she had yesterday in Georgia with Oprah Winfrey. Right, if there was not already a 12-point gender gap in the vote in Georgia, that might have helped create one. But that was yesterday in Georgia. Tonight, it was Congressman John Lewis and former Attorney General Eric Holder and Barack Obama, all at a gargantuan event, again, for Stacey Abrams in Georgia. Her Republican opponent, Brian Kemp, now doing events with Vice President Mike Pence a couple of days ago. He'll be with the president later on this weekend. I mean, I know technically there is not a presidential race on the ballot on Tuesday night, but people are so psyched for these elections this year. It really does feel like a presidential, doesn't it? And if the voting numbers stay as high through Tuesday as they have been thus far in the early voting, it's starting to look like even the numbers are going to look like a presidential race, which has never happened before. And with everything that we have been through over the past 2 years since our last election, which was a presidential, this one does sort of feel like the consequences might be just as big. In any case, final sprint. Everybody go. Got a lot to get to tonight. Stay